when I was asked to take over the month-to-month management of the group, we had already had advance notice from Microsoft that we were about to enter a new phase of our existence, but it didn't become official until after I'd been working with the group for a couple of months. So my plan since then actually has been to try to guide us through some alternatives, both on the back end and the interface, for what we're going to do with our Access Web Apps. We started with a couple of sessions on hybrid apps with the SQL Azure, a standard SQL Azure backend with a Access ACCDB front end. We moved on. We had a session with Julian Kirkness, who showed us some of the work he's doing with Zoho Creator, which is an entirely online browser-based interface. And this month, George Young, who I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell you as much about himself as he would like. He has worked for Microsoft through a good part of his career. He's also been an independent.
Okay, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, great.
I was just about to say I'm going to turn the time over to you and let you do your presentation. George is going to take us through kind of the next, what I consider more of the kind of the mainstream alternative, which is the .NET alternative to the browser-based web app interface. And again, if you want to tell us a little bit more about your background, I'll leave that to you to tell us as much or as little as you'd like.
Great.
Has this going, so I will just mute my mic and listen.
Fantastic. I think I'll turn my video off. I didn't realize I still had that on. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Can everybody hear me okay? Can anybody not hear me? Are we good?
I have you good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, great. Thank you, George Hepworth, for inviting me this month to speak about this view of what may be in your future, perhaps as a migration path for Access Web Apps. It's not often I'm in a meeting where somebody says George and I don't know who they're talking to. So it's good to have another George around. I'm George Young. I am the founder of Dawson Butte Software, which is a very small little consulting company here in Colorado. I've been doing that for about 3.5 years. I started off using Access in the early 90s, and back when the integrated Microsoft Office suite was shipping with that huge box with 30 or more 3.5-inch diskettes. I was teaching at Loyola University in New Orleans while I was in grad school at Tulane, and started moving the IS department and the business college into using the Microsoft Office suite, and for things like statistics and financial analysis. And so Access played a role in that, and I just loved it. Probably like a lot of people, I came to Access out of spreadsheets, so I was doing Lotus command language programming and then some in Borland Quattro Pro, and then migrated into Access and just loved it right out of the bat. The power, the ease of use, just a fantastic piece of software. While I was still in New Orleans in school, I co-founded an internet startup called Bourbon Street Software, and we made a program called Internet Marauder, which was a kind of an automated search and download tool. This is around 1995. In 1997, I was hired by Microsoft to go up to Redmond and work on the Internet Explorer 4 efforts. The guy who actually hired me ended up being one of the witnesses in the Microsoft antitrust trial. So the work that I was doing was tangentially related to the reason that Microsoft was sued by the Department of Justice for antitrust, which was the bundling of Internet Explorer into Windows. I started off with Site Builder Network and MSDN, spent a few years with IE and MSN and Windows, was with a little internal startup called A1, which became the Windows Security Center, which became the security control panel app for Windows XP, and also what became Security Essentials, which is now bundled with Windows 10, but it used to be a separate download in Windows 7 and Win 8. And then finally I finished up with Live and Bing. I was there when the Bing was renamed from Live Search to Bing. I left in 2009, got married, moved to Colorado. I live here with my wife and 4 kids, and again, I do some consulting, mostly .NET development, and almost always Access is in there somewhere. So I've kind of grown with Access over the years and done a lot of web development, usually extending Access. So that's where I'm coming from. So the agenda is that we're going to take a quick look at Access Web Apps, talk about potential migration paths, and then talk about ASP.NET MVC, and then we'll actually do a migration all the way from an Access Web App to an MVC app, and my claim is that that can be done in 20 minutes. We'll see if I can hold to that, and then a wrap up.
Can I take in for just a second? I'm sorry. Apparently a couple of people are not getting the audio, so before you get into the meat of the presentation, just verify, is anybody, well, I guess they can't hear me.
You can ask them to go into the chat window.
Yeah.
Are we not hearing yet? Still not hearing.
Let's see. Actually, Peter and Tom. Peter Doring was not, so
So some people can hear us. Hey, Kevin Bell, is my audio okay? Is it too loud, too soft? Is it good?
I'm hearing you just fine.
Great, thank you.
I'm on Skype for Business, though.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm using.
Yeah, so am I. So I'm going to mute again until we hear.
Oh yeah, Peter, I've had all kinds of config issues depending on the device I plug in. So I'm with you, man.
Yeah, that's why I signed in a half hour early.
Bummer, Tom. Hopefully we're recording, and Tom will be able to get the audio later. Okay, should I proceed or what?
Yeah, I think we're pretty. Yeah, we don't want to delay too much.
Okay, cool. If anybody is having issues, I'm not going to have the chat window up, but I'm sure Lucy and George Hepworth do. So, and either of you, please feel free to interrupt me if we need to do some config stuff. So I will go back to the presentation. We'll talk about potential migration paths, ASP.NET MVC, and then we'll actually do the migration and do a wrap-up. So we've done the introductions. So Access Web Apps. So real quickly, my experience was, and maybe like some of you, I fired up Access 2013 and saw all of these web globes in that startup screen. And I said, what is this? And started playing around with them, and then I think actually Kevin Bell came and did a presentation for the Denver Access User Group very early on web apps. I think either they either was still in beta or it was right when they released with his famous baseball, I think it was a baseball card app. Very cool. And so I looked at it and I thought, oh, this is interesting. I had already been doing a lot of web applications at the time, and from my perspective as somebody who had relatively deep web experience, Access was fantastic, except that it didn't have a web story. And I know that there have been a variety of different sort of less than totally successful initiatives out of Access. but none of them seemed to have stuck. So I thought maybe this was this. And I did a few tests and noted some of the limitations in the UI, and both in terms of the development environment for code, in terms of the UI layout, and also especially from the user experience, given that it was locked into SharePoint and that it had a terrible mobile view at the time. But what I did see was that it was a great way to reach a specific audience, maybe as part of your overall Access database story, so that rather than moving your client database into the Access web app, maybe having migrating all your data into that backend database, and then hooking up your Access client to that Azure SQL database, and then just having small bits and pieces of that available as Access web apps. So, for example, you have somebody in a clerical position who needs to do a lot of data entry. All they need is a real simple form, and they're in SharePoint. So that's a great thing. It puts them into a central database that, because it's in SQL, you can access from a whole bunch of different places, including from an Access client. So I did some various explorations. I built of course, a classic Access client application using the Azure Web App backend, also hooking up Excel and doing some charting. I built a Windows Phone 8 application, and also ASP.NET. From my perspective, the pros for Access web apps were that, first of all, for what it did, I thought it did it very well. Like, one of the things that really impressed me was that it automatically built your related tables. So if you had one-to-many tables, or even if you had a many-to-many with a join table, the Access web app infrastructure built out those forms for you, which I thought was really nice. For very, very simple scenarios of data entry and viewing and some quick searches and lookups, it had that nice search filter thing on the left. I thought it was very good for that too. But ultimately, the downsides of being locked into SharePoint, having a terrible mobile experience, having a really poor programming interface, relying on macros, no VBA, and the fact that the database, even though it was in Azure, was locked down for management and access to it, which I understand, because the Access web services were managing all the database provision and management. So it makes sense that it would be locked down, but it was a limitation in terms of if you want to do a lot of stuff in SQL itself. So ultimately, I ended up not doing any production applications in that, and instead kind of stuck to MVC and continued to do a number of applications which have access, but have access talking to SQL Server rather than going through the Access web services, and then also having that same SQL Server be the backend for web applications as well. So, for example, I have a big governmental client here in the Denver area that started off with an Access client. We took a quick look at Access web apps, and then instead went with pure SQL Server as a backend. And then, so the client still is there. We put the client in an Azure VM so that the speed of the remote data access is much faster, and also it avoids some of the driver issues and the port issues. If you're within a corporate firewall and you're trying to punch through port 1433, say, to get to a SQL database backend, or if you need the ODBC13 driver, putting that in a VM in the cloud, get rid of all those problems. And then we have a web interface which uses that same database, and that seems to be a pretty nice approach. So with the cancellation or the end of lifing of Access web apps, I know that there are some migration paths that have been put forth, and I know George has done some really great articles on some of these, and I just thought I would take a quick look at this list and maybe highlight some pros and cons. And if anybody, I'll stop at the end of this list, and if anybody wants to chime in with some additional thoughts on that. So one of the things that has been advised is a SharePoint list. You know, and obviously the pros and cons there. You lose the relational database. If you're in a SharePoint environment, it's a pretty handy migration. Power Apps. I don't totally understand how that's a good migration path, to be frank. I think it's a V1 product, and maybe by V3 it's going to be a really great story. But Power Apps itself is a little bit clunky right now. It's kind of like Azure Web Apps V1. There's not a good programming interface. You still have, you're still typing scripts and macros into little text boxes. You're locked into a fairly constrained user interface. You can only do a mobile or a PC/tablet version separately, at least the last time I looked at it. I'd imagine they're going to be improving that. And it doesn't have all the data management that Access itself has. There have been some proprietary solutions that have been put forth. One of them was, I should have written it down because now I can't remember what it's called. But basically, it's a canned package solution that I think costs a few $1,000s plus hosting fees, and you basically migrate your Access web app into a proprietary framework, and you have kind of this WYSIWYG thing where you can pick controls, but it's alpha. I think it's called alpha. And I saw that and thought, this is not a really good solution, because it sort of locks you into their proprietary framework. You have a very limited UI. Now it's nice you can generate a mobile app real quickly, but no more quickly, and certainly much more expensive, and certainly of much lower quality, I would argue, than ASP.NET. Another solution that I think is, I don't know if people have looked at this, and we sort of stumbled upon it, and that is the thing I mentioned earlier for our governmental client, which is full access running in the cloud in a virtual machine. So you can open Azure, and I'm going to talk about Azure, but obviously there are other alternatives like Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services. But in the case of Azure, you can open up a VM, for, I don't know, $50, $60 a month maybe, and then you can provision Office 365 using click to run, which basically means that you're not actually installing software for users. Basically, the click to run installs it for you, and then manages the authentication through the Office 365 subscription. So if you have people that are on Office 365 or thinking about migrating to Office 365 and want to have the ability to, say, work from an iPad, I think this is actually a really, really great solution. Now, it doesn't work well on mobile phones. Maybe back in the stylus days it would have, but hard to imagine working through a normal Access Forms application shrunk down to a 5-inch diagonal screen. And then finally, ASP.NET, which I'll talk a little bit more about the pros and cons in a bit. Does anybody have any thoughts on this list of items here and want to chime in and maybe have a little conversation before we move on?
A couple of thoughts. Yeah, Alpha Anywhere is what I believe the name of the tool you're referring to. I would like to get someone who's actually used it in production to do a session. Down the road in a couple of months, but everything I've heard about it coincides with what you just said. Proprietary, closed environment, relatively expensive compared to some of the other alternatives. But there are adherents to that, and I would like to sort of bring it in for a quick view.
Yeah, Andy Tabiz was doing some presentations on it a year back or so he might be somebody to reach out to. If he's still, he may have totally just gotten away from that. I don't know.
These days, that's my the last conversation I had with him.
Let me switch over to the chat window, see if there's anything else. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I will move onward and upward. So ASP.NET MVC. So I'm going to real quickly talk through the high-level architecture just to give an overview, and then it will, as we actually do a migration, hopefully it will become, it will put some meat on the bones. But basically, MVC it's a development architecture. It stands for Model View Controller. It maps in some ways to Access. If you think about your database as just the data and you split front end, back end, and then if you wrote code to generate your forms and views sort of on demand and populate them all in VBA, that might be somewhat similar to the ASP.NET MVC architecture. What the model is it is a representation of your data, and every table has a class. Every table is a class object, and every field in a table is a property. So it's basically objects and properties that map to your database. The view is, what we might consider the form in Access. It's the web page. It's the screen that actually renders and is shown to the user in the web browser. And the controller is the piece that handles the routing between when the user types in or clicks on a URL, and then the controller takes over and says, okay, let me look at this URL, and then says, oh, you're on the orders table, so I'm going to send you over to the orders table, and then you have a little code in there that does the query and returns the data, and then controller then hands that data off to the view, and the view renders it. So that's Model View Controller. It's sort of a clean separation of development concerns there. The development is done primarily in C# or VB, so it supports both those development languages, and then HTML, which of course is hypertext markup language. That's the angle brackets that used to render, that the browsers interpret and turn into UI elements on screen. CSS, which is cascading style sheets, which does the styling. So colors, backgrounds, fonts, widths, heights, padding, margins. That's all done in CSS. And then JavaScript is a sort of an optional thing that you can use to have client-side behavior, if you will. It's used in MVC out of the chute for validation, for example. And then the data is stored in SQL Server. The pros of ASP.NET MVC compared to some of the other possible migration paths are, first of all, it's an open standard-based framework, so you're not locked into any proprietary framework like say you would be with some of the proprietary migration paths. It's HTML, which is controlled obviously by a standards body, as is CSS and JavaScript. The SQL Server backend obviously conforms to Microsoft's version of the SQL standard, and then C# and Visual Basic, which are pretty much standardized languages. It's super powerful. So there is absolutely no restriction on what you can do. You're not locked into any sort of existing UI widgets. I mean, if you can basically make HTML do just about anything you want, and you can have all kinds of different views and child relationships and trees and tables and flyouts and drop downs and hover effects. It's extremely powerful. It also, of course, has a huge installed base. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of Visual Studio developers there are in the world using especially C#, but also VB, and developing MVC applications. But it's it's a huge install base of users, so it's extremely well documented. So there's documentation everywhere, tutorials, free videos. It's just a very well documented and heavily used system. So there's a lot of critical mass, if you will. It's also easy to find people who have the skill set to work with it. The challenges for Access developers are, I think, twofold based on talking to Access developers who don't have a web background. One is that it's not WYSIWYG. So when you're doing your development, you're actually working in almost in Notepad with syntax highlighting. So instead of dragging and dropping and positioning, say, a text box like you would in Access, and then setting the height and width and other properties on that in the properties window, you're basically doing it as if you're writing a config file in Notepad. It's not challenging. It's not brain surgery or rocket science, but it does present a hurdle for a number of people. So a certain proportion of people that have spent time in Access and just really love the power of the Access WYSIWYG developer and designer interface. It's a big barrier to not have that drag and drop and use the properties window, and you'll see what I mean. Now there are only probably 20 or 30 HTML elements that you will be working with, and Visual at the most. I usually work with maybe 10, and Visual Studio gives you syntax highlighting and statement completion and all that, so it makes it very easy to work with. But it's a different model of development, so that's a challenge. And rather than, say, like for example in Access, you drag something, you look at it, and then you're done. That is what it is. When next time you open the form, that's what you see. When you're working with a web app, you actually are modifying the underlying code, and so the development cycle is a little bit different. You modify the code, you save, and then you Alt-Tab to the browser and you hit F5 to see it. So there's a decoupling between where you're working and where your output is. So it's a little bit, that would be a little bit akin to writing a VBA module in the code window, and then Alt-Tabbing in Windows back over to the form itself and seeing how it works. It's a little bit more like that. So you don't have that drag and drop. So those are the main challenges. The one thing I didn't talk about that I think is an advantage is that it's pretty much free. Due to the competition from open source software, Microsoft has made a lot of their development tools absolutely free. So you can get Visual Studio for free, you can get SQL Server for free, you can host in Azure for free, you can get the Migration Assistant for free. So the only cost, until you have a paying client who actually wants a professional level of, let's say, Access hosting, your only cost is your time. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that migration looks like. So to migrate from AWA to MVC, there are basically two big steps. And again, I tip of the hat to George Hepworth, who's written some really great articles on getting your data out of the Azure Web App database. And I went through his articles and actually used one of his articles when I did my first migration out. So the two steps are migrating the data out of Azure, out of Access Web App Azure SQLDB into SQL Server. And then the second thing is now we got to generate the web app. And this is one of the things that is just really, really great about taking this ASP.NET MVC approach is that, as you'll see, we will not write a single line of code, and we will have a full-blown CRUD set of forms and views written for us. So the things that we need to do to migrate out of Azure, of Access Web App to SQL Server is, and this is the approach that I took, is I created a new Access application, and I import the database tables from the Azure SQL database. That was the back end to the web app. And then I use the Migration Assistant to take it from Access to SQL Server. So let's have a quick look at what that looks like. So here is the web app. So this is a Northwind Orders web app that I built using a subset of an Access database. So what I did is I basically took an Access client database and imported it into the Access web app. And you can see classical customers, employees, orders, and products. And then orders, of course, has the order details table. In order to get this out of the Azure SQL database backend, what you do is you go customize an Access, or you may already have the AACDW file. But you open that guy, and over in the backstage, I think it was called, it's been a while, but over in the backstage, if you click File, and you get all this, you get your little sort of options and properties and so forth window, and you have this Manage Connections under Info, and down here, you, if you haven't already, turn on the connections that will allow you to then log in and get that data straight from the database. And what you do is you just view it, for example, and here's the connection information for that database, which I have to remember to change after this after this presentation. So what we do is we basically pull this information out, and then we go off and we start migrating. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up a new database. And we'll just do a blank database, and I will put it on my, we'll just put it on the desktop. And I'll call this AWA migration. Okay, so I'm just creating a blank database and create. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is to close this guy, and we're going to go external data, new data source, from other sources, ODBC. This is how we're going to hook up to that remote Access Web Services Azure SQL database backend. Actually, I have SSMS running. Let me go over there and show you what that looks like. So as you may have run across, what happens when you create your Access web app, Azure services in SharePoint and in Azure provision this database, and they use this GUID for a name, and they generate a whole bunch of tables. Every data table that you have has an images folder, or an images table, I'm sorry. There are also these event arguments and action events, and then a whole bunch of schema information and data information. But you'll notice that in here we have really just Access customers, Access employees, order details, orders, and products. So this is the live database that we're going to hit to suck that data out of. So we're going to import the source data into a new table, and it needs to be a machine data source, at least in my experience. So we're going to create a new one. We'll create a system data source next. And you know, no matter what version of Windows I have, I always get these things in Portuguese. And I'm not quite sure why. And I guess Triber would be German. So I got German and Portuguese, but we're going to go down to native client. So we're going to go SQL Server native client 11, pick that guy, go finish. And now we're going to do this. Give it a name. And we're going to connect to that server. You'll recall we pulled that data out of the Access client, and I have this data kind of over here in Notepad. So here's the server name. I'm going to put that in. Okay. Next. We're going to log in using SQL Server authentication. So there's my external writer. And grab the password. Next. This is really important. We need to set the default database for that, for this, because unlike, say, if we were connecting to a regular SQL database where we would log in using the admin credentials and we could read all the databases, in this case, we can only log in using these credentials to that specific database. So we have to get that database name in there. So we'll go next. Here. Oops. There we go. Maybe I should put it in the right spot. Okay. Beautiful. Okay, let's test the data source. And it worked. Okay. So, where is it? Okay, let's try this again. I'm not sure why that disappeared. Machine data source. Did I miss something there? Why is my data source not showing up? Well, we get to create a new one again. Sorry about that. SQL native client. Finish. Go back down here. Okay, we want it to call it maybe it needs that field. Oops. Okay, that SQL Server auth. Set the default database to this. Okay. And okay. All right. Anybody have any ideas why I'm not seeing my
One thing I can think of, I don't know that you need to, but I always use encryption. And I don't know if that's the problem, or if you have appropriate permissions. You're logged in as an administrator.
Anybody else have any thoughts? This is kind of weird, because I do need to use a machine data source.
It seems to me you have to launch the ODBC outside of Access. If you launch it from inside of Access, it does weird things. I think that's a known issue.
Really? Huh. This,
And make sure you get make sure you get the 32-bit version of ODBC. It's been years since I've done it, but
yeah. Well, here's the crazy thing, Kevin. I just did this before, right before this meeting as a test, and it was all here. So, but it's you know what's weird is for some reason this list isn't scrolling. So I'm not quite sure why. Let me take that. You know what? I have one that was connected before. So let me see if this will work. So this is one I built before. Maybe my list is. Maybe you can only have 7 in the window and there's no scroll bar. I don't know. Let's see if this works. Okay, so we're getting that. So what I did is let's hand wave and say assume that creating that DSN worked. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting the actual data tables that I want to bring in. I'm going to go OK. And importing. Okay. And now we have the 5 tables that came in. I'm going to rename them real quick and just get rid of the access in the front of them just for easier naming, and get rid of the space there, order detail. This is one of those kind of SQL convention holy wars, right? Do you have plural? Do you have your data tables as plural or singular. So now I've got all these tables. The other thing I have to do after I brought them in, and you'll see they have all the data in there that came in from the Azure SQL database. The last thing I need to do is to do the relationships. But you'll note that, I don't know if you'll note that, but I don't have a primary key. So the primary key didn't come over. So what I need to do is to set a primary key on each of these real quick. So design key, boom, boom, primary key. Design, view, boom, boom, primary key. Design, boom, primary key. Okay. So I'm going to close all those windows now that I have the primary key set, and I need to set up my relationship. So that's the kind of a bummer that the primary key and foreign key relationships aren't preserved. But on the plus side, it's pretty easy to drag and drop and do these once we have the data all brought in. So order detail is order ID to order ID, and I just enforce referential integrity, create. A product is related to an order detail, so product ID goes to ID. And employee, I'm sorry?
Your screen is off.
My screen is off. Oy. How long ago did that happen?
Just when you switched back from, yeah, not long.
Yeah,
Okay.
A couple of seconds, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can share. Thank you. Let me know when it shows up. Thank you very much, by the way. When I close the indexing. Yeah, indexing. Oy. Let me know when you can see that.
Back.
We good?
Yes,
Are we
we're
good?
good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. So we're hooking up the relationships, and we have order also to customer. So customer ID goes here. Customer ID goes there. There we go. And enforce referential integrity. So all I had to do was basically, as you can see, I had to set up those foreign key relationships. But now that I've done that, I can save that. So I can go ahead and close this relationship window. And I'm going to close this Access database. So the next thing we're going to do is to put it into SQL Server, which you'll recall is part 2 here, SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access. So we've got it out of Access Web Apps. We've got all of our data back into Access, and now we're going to pop it into SQL Server using SSMA, the SQL Server Migration Assistant, which is a free download. And we'll just go ahead and go. I'm not going to spend time on this. I'll just quickly run through it. But basically, we add a database, go to the desktop. There's our database. Next. Boom. Pick the tables we want. And we've got those guys all looking good. Next. We're going to put it into our local SQL Server. We could also put it into Azure from here, but we're not going to do that. And we'll just call this AWA to MVC. Okay, next. Create it, you betcha. And we could link the tables, which would blow away the existing data tables that we have. We don't want to do that, so we're just going to convert. And the only time you ever have to worry about problems really is if you have errors. You'll usually almost always get warnings, and it's like you have spaces or this or that. But the only thing that matters is down here at the bottom in the output area where my mouse is hovering, 5 tables successfully migrated. Close that. We don't want to save that. Let's go to our SQL Server, which I must have closed. SQL Server Management Studio. And we'll now have that database here in our local SQL Server instance. So databases, there it is. and there are our tables brought over from Access, and select top 100 rows. So there's our data. Booyah. So we are safe and free and out of Access Web Apps, and now we have it in a SQL Server. So now we can, the world is our oyster. We can do anything we want with this. And what we're going to do now is, in the next 5 minutes, generate a full-blown ASP.NET MVC web app from that. So, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details. I'm just going to run through this just to give you an idea. You can come back and watch the video, and I do have a pointer to a good tutorial at the end of this. So we're going to launch Visual Studio, File, New Project. We're going to dialog that's going to ask us what we want. We're going to pick Web and ASP.NET Web Application. Let's go ahead and call this AWA to MVC. And we'll go OK. It then asks us what kind of app we want to build. We're going to say MVC app. One of the great things about ASP.NET is you can authenticate. You can authenticate against individual accounts. You can authenticate against network on an intranet. You can authenticate against Office 365 and Azure accounts, but we're just going to do no auth. So we've got an MVC picked, and we're going to go OK. This is going to basically give us a templated web app that has just a kind of a welcome page. And OK, it's done. And you'll see over here on the right, I'm going to close this window. Over here on the right, you can see that we have Model, View, Controller. So that's that MVC. So the data model is going to go in here. The views that we have go here. So we see we have a home view, and the controllers, we have a controller for each of the set of views that we have. So we have a home controller. So I'm going to hit Control F5, which is how we build and launch the website. And what happens is that Visual Studio has a local web server that it runs in development. It's localhost, and then it puts a port on to differentiate your application. So you can run a website locally without having IIS or anything running. So this is a default web app that was built. All right, so now we have that scaffolded out, and now that we have that built out, let's go ahead and add our data model. So we come back to our slide. You can see that we built the new ASP.NET MVC solution. Now we're going to create the ADO.NET Entity Data Model, and then we're going to scaffold out the controllers and views. So now what I want to do is to build those models. I want to get those classes that map to my database. This is one of the great things in Visual Studio. I right-click and add on the models folder ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So I'll just leave the defaults. Model 1, we're going to do a designer from the database. So that what this is going to do is going to generate the model for us from an existing database. I'm going to connect to that database, which is the local machine, and AWA MVC, okay? Test the connection, looking good, go OK. And it's going to give it this name of AWA2 MVC entity. Go next, entity framework, and now it's going to ask us what we want to import. We've got all our tables in here. We're going to bring them in. Okay, this is kind of similar to the taking it from Access out to SQL. Now we're sort of taking it from SQL into MVC. So what happens right now is that the Visual Studio.NET Visual Studio entity data model is being generated from the database. And you'll see what happened here is that we get a diagram that should look a lot like our entity relationship diagram that we had in Access. So Visual Studio built that out for us, right? So that is generated for us from the database, and you can see these classes map exactly to the tables, and the properties within that class or that object map to the database fields. So I'm going to build, and when you build it, what it does is it'll turn all that into code. And if you look over here on the right now under models, before it was empty, and now I have this model EDMX, and notice I have customer.cs, employee.cs, order.cs, order detail.cs, and product.cs. So what it did, what these are mappings of our database table, all done for us. This is essentially our data connection, if you will, all built out for us. So now we have a data model, and now the last thing we do is to scaffold out the controllers and views. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. Again, how much code have we written? Nary a line. Controllers, so when we built the data model, we clicked on Models, Add. Now we're going to add a scaffolding, which is a controller with a set of views. So add new scaffolded item, and we pick MVC controller using Entity Framework. We go ahead and pick which model we want to build on. So let's say we want to build on customer. And our data context class is the AWA MVC entities. And now what happens is that Visual Studio in the templating engine is going to talk to that class, and he's going to say, okay, I'm going to build a controller that's going to build all the CRUD code that you need for read, update, delete, and edit. And I'm going to build a view for each of those. So you notice in views over here on the right, all we have is home and shared. And under controllers, I don't have it expanded, but all we had was home controller. So I'm going to go add now. And what this guy is going to do is to scaffold that out for us. And so here's the controller. Now we have a customer controller, and notice that we have a customer's folder under views. And we have create, delete, details, edit, and index. I'm going to hit Control F5 just to run the site again. And you'll recall that it built the customer's controller. Now, we're not going to build the UI for this, which is actually really easy, but we're just going to go to /controllers, which, it actually went to customers. So actually, here it is built out for us. So here is the default table that was automatically scaffolded out for us. I can add a new company by typing in the data here. I can view the details on an existing company, and I can even edit it. So let's go ahead and edit, and let's say that the owner of company A is Hepworth George. I'm going to save that, and now notice that George Hepworth is the owner of that company. So all this is scaffolded out for us. If we want to do any editing, this is where we're going to, if we don't have a web background, we're going to have a little bit of comfort with basic HTML. And I'll just quickly show you what that looks like. So here we have a table and a TR, which you might imagine is a row, and then a TH, which is a table header. And then here we have that syntax to actually get the properties out of the database, querying out of that database. And then down below, we have a for each loop, right, for each item and model, and then we have a row which has a cell for each of these. And that's basically the extent of the HTML. But again, as I mentioned in the pros and cons, again, one of the cons is you kind of have to be willing to sort of get your hands dirty in angle brackets. But one of the nice things is it's really easy to change. So let's say over here, I only want to show the company name, the first name, the last name, the owner, and the phone number. So I want to get an address, city, state, zip, country, zip, blah, blah, all that. So all I have to do is over here and start at business phone in the header and just get rid of all that, and then come down here to business phone in the body and get rid of all that. And now I hit Control S, Alt Tab, F5. And now what I have is just those columns that I want to have appearing. So and I think we actually did it in 20 minutes, considering the false start on the ODBC thing. I'm not quite sure actually why that happened, so I'll have to investigate that. But that's it. The last thing we could do is we could publish this up to Azure, which would just take a couple of minutes, but I think I'd rather have some time for Q&A unless people want me to publish to Azure, in which case we can do that, and then you can all start pinging that and hitting the putting your own data into the database. So I will pause and ask if there are any questions, concerns, doubts.
I think you already addressed this, but basically at this point it's a matter of having a site where you publish and you're done.
Yep. Yep. And actually, thank you. Let me quickly go do that. So ASP.NET resources. So the Visual Studio that we use, it's free. Here's the URL. SQL Server Migration Assistant that we use to take it out of Access into SQL free, here's the URL. SQL Server Developer Edition, so I'm running full SQL here on my local machine, that's free. And Azure, you get 10 websites free with when you sign up, no money, and you get 5 databases for free if you do the Visual Studio Dev Essentials, which is also where you get that. So yeah, we could host five sites with databases for free in Azure. So yeah, and I can walk through doing a publish to Azure if people are interested. It's actually kind of cool. Or we can take questions or whatever people would like to do.
Let's first see what questions we've got from
okay.
People who are here. I would like to see it, but I don't want to close off questions if there aren't any yet.
Anybody have any questions or?
Yep, I have a question.
Yes.
Hi. So that rendering that you did right now looked like a list control. How do you add other types of controls into this application? Let's say you wanted it one of the columns to be or fields to be a drop-down box, for example.
Right. Okay. So that is a drop-down box is another element of HTML called a select. So, and it's very easy to wire up to your data, but let me just quickly, so it's select, oh, I don't want to put it in the header area, and then option, and then to, and so forth. So if I hit F5 and I come back over here, hopefully we're going to have a drop-down. Yep, there we go. And same thing for checkboxes and inputs. Like I said, there's probably 15 to 20 controls like this. Okay. So the form controls, if we go over to the edit, let's see, let me go to edit. Let's see, do we have any drop-downs? Now these are all text boxes. So that's an input type select. A checkbox is an input type checkbox. A radio button is an input type radio button.
Okay, so George, another question, if you don't mind.
Yes.
So this is a web application. What happens
Yes.
if you wanted it to be a mobile application?
Thank
do
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't have planted that question any better. So I'm going to hit F12 in my browser here, which is the developer tools. So again, one of the great things about being in the web world is that you have all these amazing tools. So I can actually right-click on this and go inspect. And over here, I see the rendered HTML, right, on that element. And I can do stuff like set, background, red. And notice that it changed over here. So I can do all that kind of great stuff. The other thing I can do is I can set it into mobile mode. So up here at the top, you can see it says toggle device toolbar, and you see it's got like a tablet and a phone. I hope you can see that where my mouse is. I'm going to click that and watch what happens to the field labels and to the text boxes. So ready? 1, 2, 3. I don't know if you saw that. So what it did is it put it into a vertical, and it also gave me a drop-down menu with my links that were on the top menu. Let me do that again. I'm going to go back to mobile, or back to desktop. So here's my desktop view. Notice I have home, about, and contact. And notice that my form is label element, new line label element. Go into mobile mode. notice that now I have those menu items up here automatically generated, and it's all in a mobile view. So you thank you for that question. You actually get mobile for free right out of the box without doing anything. Our user group website is built using MVC, and it was built from Access databases that I migrated into SQL and then built this site. Now you can tell here I've got a little bit more custom-y looks and feel, but if I go F12 on this guy, notice that right now I have my drop-downs. And again, I didn't write anything. So if I want to see the consultants, I click on that. Here's the consultants. If I want to see our sponsors, click on that. Here are our sponsors. Yeah, here's the desktop view. Here's the mobile view. Let's go to presentations. So here's the presentations view in mobile, and it just automatically resized for us. If I go on this, there's the full, desktop view. So that gives you an example of how that works. Thank you. That was a great question. I forgot to cover that. Multi-column combo boxes. So, yeah. So this is really. You know what, Peter? That's a great question, because this is another thing that that creates a barrier for not only Access developers, but anybody that's used to working in a rich Win32 control environment, is that things like multi-column combo boxes don't exist in native HTML. So you kind of have this, you have to kind of get into this like zen of HTML, if you will, where you're comfortable with having fewer and not as rich native controls, and the trade-off is that your application is now available everywhere and on any device. So you definitely do give up that. Now there are third parties that do custom HTML stuff. So there probably is a package out there that you can get, and it's probably free, but it's not native to HTML. And what I usually do when I'm working with a client and they're pushing for really crazy UI, although it's less common than it used to be, because I think people have gotten more used to the web and to the relative strengths and weaknesses of the web, is I will usually push back on that and say, you know what, there are other ways of doing this in the web that, you know, we can't do in a VB app, or we can't do in a Windows form, or we can't do in an Access client, and vice versa. So, but that is a great question, because it's, you know, you have to get used to having a much more limited set. There's a great site. What's HTML5? What is that? W3C Schools. So if you're not familiar with w3schools.com, it has really great stuff. So in this, you can find CSS, JavaScript, SQL, and other XML. So this is a great place to, you know, if you want to just play around a little bit with HTML and, you know, figure out, you know, the basic stuff, and it actually runs you through the elements and attributes and so forth and so on. So w3schools.com. Okay. I'm fine with staying a little bit late and publishing to Azure if people want to see that.
Yeah, that would be great. How do you access that? How do you link it to a website?
Yes, I will walk through that. Are there any other questions, or should we go ahead and take a dive into the deep waters? Let's do it. Okay, so Azure is a cloud hosting environment. And here it's portal.azure.com, and you'll recall from the screen that you can get 10 websites for free and 5 databases with a Visual Studio Dev membership. So what you do is you go to portal.azure.com, you sign in with your Microsoft account, you know, Live ID, hotmail.com, whatever, and then you get, basically, it provisions you and sets you up, and then you can go ahead and start creating stuff. Now, what we have here is we have two things. We have a database in SQL. So we have a full-blown application locally. We have our database, which is over here in SQL, right? Local local database on Maracana, AWA2 MVC. So that's our SQL Server database that we migrated out of Web Apps into Access and out of Access into SQL. And then we have our application over here, which is living in the file system on our local machine. I think it's under, let's see, open in folder. So this is under C user documents, Visual Studio projects, AWA to MVC. So we got these two things now. We want to get them up in the cloud. So how we do that is in Azure, we can either create the resources here in the cloud, or we can create them locally and upload it. So let's create the website here in the cloud, and then we'll just let the database be created automatically. So I'm going to go over here to New Web and Mobile App. Okay, and I'll put it in existing service group. Use existing. Let's see what I have here. DOS and Mute group sounds good. And we'll just go create. There's a I need to give it a name, don't I? So AWA to MVC. Is that available? Oh yeah, we got our own Azure site. So I'm going to create. Oh, not available. Oh, is available. Okay. So what's happening on the background? If you look over here on the toolbar, it says deployment in process. Deployment to resource group.org is in progress. So it's creating that web app. Okay, it takes about a minute to basically provision that. Let's go ahead and get our database up into Azure. I think this is actually really kind of neat. So I'm going to right-click over on the database here in SQL Server. Remember, again, I'm in my local development environment, local SQL Server here on my local machine. This is actually SQL Server Developer Edition, the free one. Right-click, Tasks, Deploy Database to Microsoft Azure SQL Database. Go OK. Next. There's the database name. Now I have to log in, and I'm going to put it in gcyoung.database.windows.net. And you know what? Yeah, for in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and do that. Okay. Okay. And I'm going to have to use SQL Server authentication. Okay, so it's kind of cool. From SQL Server Management Studio, I actually just logged into Azure and created a database. And you can see it asks me what size I want, standard, premium, data warehouse. I can spend thousands of dollars a month on databases if I want. Basic is the $5 a month database. So I'll just click, yeah, fine. One of the other things that nice about Azure is you only pay for while your thing is running. So if you shut it down, you're not paying for it. So for example, for a virtual machine, if you only run it 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, instead of paying $50 a month, you're paying $12 a month or something. Same case with this rolling up this web database right now. The minute we're done, I'm gonna delete it, and I'll be billed maybe a penny for it. So what's happening in the background is Azure is creating this database and getting ready to upload it. Oh, too fast. So let's go finish, and you see it's starting to do the migration up to Azure. Let's go back to the Azure portal, and let's see if our website has been created. So let's go to App Services, AWA to MVC. So there it is. So this is actually created in the cloud. So if I go to browse here up at the top, I browse that, and it's going to go to awa.mvc.azurewebsites.net. You see it's got this blank guy, right, with apparently a video loading. But this is the template that says, hey, your site is created. But now we want to deploy to it. Again, there are a few ways of doing that. I'm going to say get the publish profile. And this is actually kind of neat. What happens is that Azure generates a publish profile which has configuration and credentials and so forth. So show it in the folder. So here in my downloads folder, I've got this AWA to MVC publish settings file. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. And I'm going to right-click up here on my app and go Publish. And I'm going to say Import. And I'm going to browse in my Downloads folder and AWA to MVC Publish Settings and go OK. So what that's done is you can see it's populated it with all kinds of information, a username, a password, a site name, a URL, and a destination URL, basically of where this is going to go. I'm going to validate it to make sure. Let me go back over to SQL while we're there. Okay, so SQL is still deploying my database up to Azure. Let's go back to MVC. Okay, the connection is validated. So now I'm going to go to Settings, and the last thing I need to do is to tell Azure that I'm not using this local data source. I'm using a database up in Azure. So in Settings for my database, I'm going to click this guy, and I'm going to again get that same connection dialog, so that I'm going to connect to my Azure database server, and I'm going to use SQL Server authentication. And there's my database name, and let's test the connection. Test connection succeeded. Okay, and notice that my data source now says gcm.database.windows.net. So it's when I publish, it's going to use this connection string at runtime, as you can see this box check. So that's basically saying, hey, yeah, the config in this website locally uses a local SQL server, but when you pop it up to Azure, use the Azure database instead of the local database. So it looks like operation completed and was successful on deploying our database. So we'll go close. We're done with that. And now let's go ahead and click Publish here. So if all goes well, we already have the database up there. Visual Studio is using the configuration that we got from the Publish profile that we downloaded, plus the added setting of pointing it to the database on the server. And it's a first time publish, so it's publishing a lot of stuff, so it may take a little while. But it's launched it. Notice that it's up AWA to MVC.AzureWebsites.net. What happened was when Visual Studio finishes deploying, it launches the browser to your site. So in theory, once it finishes doing a cold boot, it's basically bootstrapping it from ground zero, so it takes a little bit to start up. But once it's up and running, there we go. So now if I hit F5, you can see it's actually fairly fast. Boom, boom. So you recall that I think the controller was customers. So let me see, did I do that right? Customer. Oh, there we go. And we even have the goofy drop-down. So that's it. So now if you on your phone or on your PC or your tablet or whatever, go to AWA to MVC.AzureWebsites.net, you will see this site, and you can actually go in and start editing stuff. So that's how easy that is. Again, I went through it fast just so that I could cover it all, but hopefully you got the feeling that, yeah, there's a couple things you got to do, but you know, we basically went from having an Access Web App database to having a local SQL database and a local web app to having an Azure-based database and web app in a matter of, what time is it? Less than 45 minutes. So, okay, let me go back over to the text window. Okay. Great. Any questions on that? Somebody want to hit this and make a change to maybe Company B? And I'll just refresh just so we can confirm that people are able to do this.
It would something if we could do that.
George, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So I've noticed you published it to AzureWebsites.net. What
Yes.
happens if you had your own website called 123.com, whatever you want to call it?
Yes, so you can have custom domains. Absolutely. For example, so again, to use the dog.org, our Denver user group, this is hosted on a local company called GearHost, who actually sponsors us. So they give us email and hosting. So we host it there. But if I let me see here. If I go, oh, sorry, let me see. Do I have dog up in here somewhere? I don't. But I can publish to that, and GearHost has a published profile for theirs. Similarly, in Azure, I can set up a custom domain. So I just use the free, the free AzureWebsites.net domain.
Right.
But yeah, you can absolutely do custom domains, and you can publish. You don't have to publish to Azure. You can publish to GearHost. You can publish to just about anywhere.
Okay.
So it looks like somebody wrote Paul here, so we did have a change. Sorry, go ahead.
Great. Yeah. So Azure seems like quite a good bet. What you've just described. What about, for example, you could use it on your mobile app, but you wanted to have it published to, let's say, for an iPhone, on iTunes or Android, for example, which is easier. Could you from ASP, could you design an app that sits on the Google Play Store site, and so users could download it to access your application?
So that another great question. Thank you. My understanding, and I haven't done this, but my understanding is that the Apple Store and the Google Play Store and the Windows 10 Store all have support hosted apps, where basically you just have an application shell and you host the web page within that. Okay. So that is definitely one option. So what you would get is, you would get, let me go to the mobile view here. So you see how we got the vertical thing happening again. And then there's an edit link, and you tap that and you can edit. So, and you can see the little circle there. Imagine that's your thumb or something. So this could be hosted within. You can also, if you're so inclined, write an Android or an iOS application that talks to that Azure database living in Azure. Yeah, so you can so definitely all those. Yeah. And there's also the intermediate thing which uses PhoneGap. I think it's called Apache Cordova Tools now. Taco Tools for Apache Cordova, I think. Yeah. So it's kind of this hybrid where you write it in JavaScript, and it's easier than writing in, say, Objective-C or Swift or whatever the iOS language is now. And you still get kind of a richy, kind of sort of nice iOS-looking application. So there, yes, but the easy thing, if you wanted to limit it to the store, absolutely, you could actually. And I've done it in Windows, and it's really easy. It's like you create a blank Windows application, and then you edit a config file where you say, instead of loading C# code, just go to this URL. And that's basically all there is to it. And now you have a hosted app that you can put in the store.
Because what you've shown us right now is really inexpensive. Because you're mentioning Alpha early on. Alpha's starting price now is $5,000.
Yeah.
And if you want to publish it to iOS, it's $15,000 minimum, right? With your license. Yeah. And then that's per year.
Oh. Yeah, I'm in the wrong business.
Yeah, so this is really good.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions too. First of all, I want to thank George Young for this wonderful presentation. I think we're kind of close to the end of our session, so I will keep this short. But I do have one follow-up question, and that has to do with authentication. Obviously, I just logged in and changed myself from the owner to the principal developer of Company A. How hard is it, and what is involved in putting login credentialing into an app like this?
It is actually really straightforward. So in Visual Studio, when you create your application, you have the ability to specify any type of authentication that you want. So you can have it be you can have a local database, a set of tables that has all your users. You can use Office 365 authentication. You can use Windows networking intranet authentication. You can use Facebook, Google, or Microsoft account for authentication. And you can do that at the time that you create that you create the app. So I'll just really quick show that again. And then if you want, this is something I've done with a few clients, is you can actually build it and then add authentication in Azure in like 20 seconds. So let me show you that. So new project, ASP.NET Web Project, MVC, right here, authentication. So you can say no auth, individual user accounts. That's, you know, either within your database, or you can use Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft. You can also use Office 365, right? You come in and you put in your domain, you know, your Office 365 domain. It's fantastic. Or you can use the old school, you know, intranet if you're publishing to the internet. But let me show you that I've actually done something with a client. This is actually you know, that's a great question and a great scenario. So I have a client, big computer hardware vendor, multinational, right? And I'm just like a little punk consultant. So they're not going to give me access to their Active Directory, right, to set up authentication, you know, with reason. But I need to create for them applications that are authenticated against their Active Directory, because there's intranet stuff that I'm doing. So how do I do that if I don't have access to Visual Studio? Like, I can't log into, you know, super mega large hardware company.com. I don't have credentials. So in Azure, and I don't want to, you know, get too lost in the weeds, but this is actually really cool. So over here in the Azure portal, which I seem to have lost. So, and this is actually interesting enough that I do want to show this. So if I go over here to our application that we built, which was AWA to MVC, and this is just so cool. So I have the properties here. By the way, notice how it's showing all the usage. So you get all kinds of metrics about usage and data and average response time, how many people are hitting your website. It's mind-blowing. So I'm going to go over here to authentication, where the gold key is on the left. And I click that. I'm going to turn on app service authentication. And I'm going to say people have to log in with Azure Active Directory. Okay? And I'm going to configure that, and I'm going to say express, and I'm going to create a new app, and it's going to be called AWA to MVC. And I'm going to go OK, and I'm going to save it. Okay? So now, I just did it really fast. You notice you could configure Facebook or Google or Twitter, but what I've done now is it saved? Let's see, the notification, successfully saved. So now I'm going to go back over here to this site, and it may not ask me to, it may give me an error because I changed authentication. Okay, oh cool, it's asking me to sign in. So now I have to sign in, and I have to be, so caching credentials. So let's open this in Edge. We haven't given Edge yet. So AWA to MVC.AzureWebsites.net. AWA, I think that's right. So hopefully, George Young, hopefully because I have a fresh browser. Okay, so notice that AWA to MVC, remember I put that text in? Now it's showing up right here. Publisher website dawsonbutte.net, and it says it just needs permission to sign and read my profile. I go accept, and in theory, now I'm logged in. You cannot get here now. This is actually locked down now. Just by spending, what was that, 20 seconds on the Azure portal, I basically locked this down to being you have to log in with Active Directory. In this case, it's the Active Directory users in my dawsonbutte.net domain.
Okay,
so does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So if you wanted to open it to a Facebook group, would that be, could you do it by a group, or would it be by an individual login?
Okay, so yes, you can use groups. Okay, so yes, so basically the MVC uses ASP.NET Identity, and ASP.NET Identity out of the box supports two types of authentication: role-based authentication and user-based authentication. So you can either create a group of users or a role, a role, and then assign users to that role. or you can authenticate based on users.
Okay, so if it's an existing Facebook group, would you have to create a separate role to mirror that, or would it be able to?
I have not done any Facebook login authentication, so I do not know how that would work.
I'm getting way ahead of where we're at. I'm sorry. I happen to have a project that I'm thinking about that would be one way to do this. So I'll have to experiment myself. Sorry.
Yeah, the other thing that's happening is that as part of the ASP.NET Core 2.0 release, which is shipping, I think, sometime late summer, early fall, they are redoing authentication to something called authentication or identity as a service. So there's going to be some pretty significant improvements in the authentication services. So depending on what your time frame is, you might want to hold off until that comes out. But certainly you've got enough now that you can almost. Okay. Okay. So any other questions?
One more.
Yes.
George, so with the security, let's say you didn't want a certain group of users to see certain parts of the web application. Could you sort of, let's say you had a couple of buttons and you didn't want a certain group of users to see those buttons.
Yes.
Could you use ASP to sort of fine-tune that security that a certain group can only see those buttons and a certain group cannot?
Yes, absolutely. It's actually really, really cool. It's very fine-grained. So, and there are two ways that you can do that. So you can set access control in the controller. So that basically, you can say, okay, this method. So let's say here I have the create method. And again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but there's this thing called create, right? So I can come in here and I can say authorize and then roles equals admin. Okay. Or I can say users equals gcyoung at live.com. Okay, so I can keep people from being able to do stuff in code. So that's the controller approach. I can also keep stuff from being viewable. So you talked about the buttons. So here we have edit and delete, and we have details. So let's say that we only want to have edit and delete show up for admins, right? So what I would say is if user.is in role admin, right? And then put these guys in there in that code block, right? And then now these pieces of UI are hidden unless you are an admin.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, it's sweet. Yeah, it's real sweet.
That is much simpler than else. I'm going to say, and I'm going to end up keeping you here for another hour, so I will pay attention to my clock and honor the group. And thank you again, George Young. This has been
absolutely.
I'm going to say it's an eye-opener in a way, because I think a lot of us have had the view that this ASP. Side of it might be beyond what an Access developer would be comfortable with, but quite clearly there is a path.
There is a path.
Yeah, you can get going, yeah.
Yeah, and let me actually pull up here. So database first, entity framework, MVC. So for those of you that are really brave and have some time, so this URL here, which I guess I can paste in the window and I'll put it in my doc. If you're so inclined, you can start with a database. So you can take an Access database that you have, migrate it using the SQL Server Migration Assistant to a local SQL, and you can actually come in here and you can go through this tutorial, and you can skip the part about creating the database. But basically, I think it's got, let's see, it's got like six lessons. And And again, the first one you don't have to worry about. But if I go next here, you can see create a new web application. So this basically goes in much more detail what we have done. And so it might be a way of, hey, do I really want to do this, or do I, so I put that in the window, and I will put it here in the wrap-up slide, and then I can share this deck. I'm not quite sure how I would do that, but
well, we can figure this out.
Okay.
She can make it happen.
Cool. Okay. Can I drop a slide deck into the chat window, do you think, or?
I haven't tried that.
Let's try this. Presentations. Let's see. Copy down here. Okay. I need to do that. Oh. Did that work?
I don't know. It looked like it did.
I'm not seeing anything show up, though.
Okay. Well.
Okay. Well, in theory, there's a thing. Good night, Germany. Thank you, Peter.
Good night, Peter. Talk to you later.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody
Yeah.
for joining.
Well, thank you. I am going to make this link available through the MVP group, and I'm sure we'll get a lot more visitors because I know Peter will mention it, and even though Tom had to bow out because of audio, I'm sure he will be following up as well. So we're going to start to see, I think, some more interest from other directions, and that can't hurt.
Okay. Yeah, and if you want to bring me back for a follow-up, or if people have specific questions, please feel free to email me at gcyoung@dawsonbutte.net, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
The PowerPoint, so that's great. So I don't have a presenter lined up for next month. I've been kind of on vacation a little bit, and knowing that George Young was going to be here tonight, I let it percolate a little bit. So if anyone has a suggestion or a request of what you'd like to see next, please let me know quickly. I am going to try to find an alpha developer, a working alpha developer, to give us a presentation, and any of the other alternatives out there. So if you have any thoughts or requests, please let me know, and we'll see about getting them signed up. Thanks again to Lucy for making it all happen. And thanks one more time to George Young for a really eye-opening and very, very impressive presentation. And I'll see you all next month.